circulated so much, but it refers to those sorts of activities, extractivism, that are designed to take primary resources, from the ground, from water, obviously as well, right? If you watch The Daughter of the Lake, Hija de la Laguna, that chronicles the perspective of one woman called Nelida, who is from Chacra, which is a particular space of traditional Andean culture, in the city of Cajamarca. She leaves her chacra in order to travel to the city of Cajamarca, which is known for mining activities, right? And she becomes a lawyer, to defend the lake and the spirit of the lake, right? Which must be protected because it is an entity. So last week was, the resources there are put together to think about politics otherwise. What is in the political field, What motivates people who live through different ontologies as well as epistemologies to defend territory, to defend what gets called in Western parlance and in English nature, as if it were separate from society, right? But instead, the domain of the political actually includes what we see as the non-human, That sort of explodes Western rationalities and binaries. And it's really important to think about that as the foundation for politics for people who are moved by not necessarily just, for example, from a middle class westernized perspective, opposing on the basis of environmental leftism, mining activities or other extractive activities. Some of them also include the forming of hydroelectric dams, mega projects they're referred to. And they're often now being dressed up in the name of national development, But the conquest isn't over, because in multiple territories across Abya Yala, Latin America, we have significant populations of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. Not all of them will be necessarily opposed to mega projects, right? But those who are often have the most at stake. So, even if you didn't get the chance to, dip into all of those resources in place of last week's lecture, that unfortunately wasn't just this lecture, it was the whole day. It was just a wipeout, and I'm sorry about that, but the body says no sometimes. But I'm back, and I'm happy that you're all here as well. And I do encourage you to get a chai out in the kitchen if you haven't already. You'd have to heat it up, of course. So I want us to now move to the context of Mexico, which is one that I know probably best. It's not as if I don't have, some connections, including research and so on, with people and activists, with people who are in Colombia and Chile. Oh, you may have seen in the news the huge protests in Bolivia. Did anyone catch sight of that? But I would like us to centre on some of the contradictions within what gets called leftist populism. So this is a term that we can find in the work of Ernesto Laclau, who was an Argentine thinker, political theorist. And it helps us to sort of understand the way in which proposals such as those made by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the former president. He came to power in 2018 on a wave of support, under the banner of being post-neoliberal, This was significant. There's no way in which we can underestimate that change, because Mexico had not had such a party in pretty much the last 100 years, let's say. So there's some detail to go into there, But I must also update you with the fact that there's a new president from the same party. She has 83% popularity rating. That's probably not found anywhere else. Certainly not across the northern border compared to Donald Trump's approval rating. The party continuing to build its base as a leftist populist movement, really, because it arises out of movements, but to use discursive manoeuvres such as being the fourth transformation of the country, right? That will bring up people from poverty, that will end the perpetual cycles of violence and disappearance which have occurred for decades now in the context of the war on drugs, right? To end corruption. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about leftist populism. It appeals to people. But there are also some contradictions which we'll be looking at today, specifically within those territorial struggles, yeah? And land defence struggles that people within Indigenous contexts across Mexico are involved in. Sheinbaum is the new president. She has 83% approval rating. Honestly, when she was sworn in, I was in El Zócalo, and there were like 1 million people there. And even when AMLO was sworn in, it felt like a bit of a watershed moment. But it became quickly quite clear that along with leftist populism, we had austerity measures, increasing authoritarianism and centralisation around the executive. Things that for those of us who are on the left, or the right, one might say, right, are questionable, right? So there's a lot of complexity to talk about today. But I encourage you to look at this summary, which I generated, to demonstrate what continues to be in the picture. How much have things changed with Claudia Sheinbaum? She's a climate scientist. You might think that she might reverse some of the encroachments in the name of national development and neo-extractivism that AMLO had been pursuing in the name of generating social spending, right? She is more technocratic because she's hugely educated. She has a PhD, right? She actually is part of a team that won a Nobel Prize. So she's not a shrinking violet by any means. There's much to admire in Sheinbaum. Yeah, so I just want to put that there, yeah, and especially if we compare to across the border. And many people continue to vote for Morena, which is this leftist populist party. Now, trying to get into the substance of the lecture here and go a little bit beyond that initial sort of framing device, I'm going to share these slides because we're going to be mainly contemplating what changes at that new conjuncture or coyuntura, as we might say in Spanish. Yeah, AMLO's populist post-neoliberal development versus the comunalidad, which is very much a Oaxacan term. Yeah, from Oaxaca. My partner's from Oaxaca. Everything about our life is between Oaxaca and Australia, and well, India as well. It turns out. Comunalidad is a concept that comes out of Oaxaca, yeah? It's Senti Pensar from last week comes out of the context of riverine communities in Colombia's Pacific coast and the department of Valle del Cauca. Field thinking, the relation to place, the relation to territory as being one of it's your workplace, it's your sustenance, it's multi-generational, it's your livelihood, it's your life world, yeah? What we have with comunalidad is a commitment to mutual work. You're going to find this funny, right? So this is an other moment, right? This is an other moment. This is where you talk kind of in circles together, right? So do sip on your chai. at this point, I'm thinking that it's not just mutual work. It's a commitment to the future and to community. Yeah? Comunalidad arises out of Oaxaca, particularly in the Isthmus, and we can see it track its way across anti-mining struggles, yeah, in the Isthmus area, as well as what we'll address in the tutorials, opposing wind farms. You might think, well, how can that be pro-environmentalist if they oppose wind farms? For the self-same principles, because green grabbing, which has emerged with the trading of carbon, yeah, points and looking like there's change for confronting the climate emergency, actually is very much part of the commodity chain of extractivist operations as well. So extractivism isn't just mining, it isn't just damming, it's also those things that in a corporate kind of, I guess, top-down perspective involve the use of land without proper consent, yeah, from, in the Australian language would be traditional owners, right, to generate energy, yeah, that then can be sold on the world market. This is the primarization of resources. So even something such as wind farms in an isthmus area. Do we all know what an isthmus is? It's a connection of land. Imagine Spain and Morocco. Has anyone travelled to Spain or that part of the world? They're very much connected. It's this narrow strip, but there's also a navigatable space between there, and they're typically very windy areas. So the Zapotec people of the Isthmus, many people from community, have been opposing wind farms there because they basically amount to construction over a rural space which is part of community life that interrupts all of the social and economic activities and fabric of the area. Maybe it looks good on paper to be constructing alternative forms of renewable energy, right? But if you're not getting consent from community and it doesn't flow back to community, then it becomes problematic. There are other examples that we can refer to, such as alternative renewable energy enterprises, such as sowing canola, clearing fields to sow canola, right? Or soy. Monsanto soy, yeah, genetically modified soy. These are not good for the environment. They're dressed up that way as being alternative sources of energy, yeah? So I don't know if you know much about the use of things like canola or soy or other grains for energy.
No, I was just thinking with the wind farm, it's the exact same thing in Australia, like where I grew up, they're putting up all these wind farms, and a lot of the farmers aren't against environmental actions, but it's the exact same thing.
Interesting. So we can make some parallels.
It's being framed as green, and the farmers are being framed as right-wing, and it's not...
That's not the whole story.
Yeah.
It's very interesting you should say that, because AMLO, during his period, started to accuse local peasants and activists as being right-wing, and they're anything but. Yeah? So we'll get into the substance of that. Okay, so AMLO's populist post-neoliberal development versus the comunalidad and territorial defense of asambleas, which is a local form of self-governance, and frentes populares, popular fronts, in Mexico. Okay, so yes, just to reprise. If we'd been here in person, you would remember, but if you watch the video recording, the land and territory are central to understanding societies in movement, yeah, in Abya Yala, in Latin America. Very much so around anti-mining, such as in Peru, it's traced out in that documentary, in Cajamarca, yeah, Daughter of the Lake, but also other forms of extractivist activity that haven't involved, observing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, or ILO number 69, which is informed consent, right? So last week we had aimed to cover Indigenous and Afro-descendant movements between Peru and Colombia. You can still consult those resources if you would like to work on, for example, those cases in your final essay. But I guess what's important here is to reimagine territory not as a private property kind of regime, but instead as a space of a multiplicity of meanings, processes, and struggles. This week we'll be looking most pertinently at social environmental conflicts in Mexico, and land and territorio are of equal importance. You know what? If you haven't seen Daughter of the Lake, do see it, because that documentary is being used by activists in Mexico as well to organize. So these are subterranean connections that aren't necessarily visible even in a lot of scholarship. Frentes y asambleas, fronts and assemblies, constitute local subterranean struggles. They've multiplied across the Mexican Republic, but they also have those cross currents with other parts of Latin America and the world, arguably. Okay, I used the word coyuntura before, which we could roughly translate as conjuncture. It's in the context of the new populist leftist hegemony under Andrés Manuel López Obrador with his National Renovation Party, Morena, which succeeds 6 years of the new Partido Revolucionario Institucional, PRI, in Mexico, that had ruled as a perfect dictatorship. I remember that being referred to in one of the class presentations, for 70 plus years. Now, obviously, he didn't end pre-rural. Actually, that was ended earlier, but then the new pre was created, was reincarnated. And it was under the helm of a man married to a soap opera star, of all things. And, you know, very surface level, very much like, oh, this is a young person, he is going to be progressive on some fronts. But probably under Peña Nieto, who we'll talk about as well, we saw an increase of crackdowns on violence and a complete delegation of anything like territorial rights, yeah? AMLO still inherits this, though. So that's what's interesting. But it is a time of change, as well as certain kinds of continuities and contradictions. We see a morphing of, the political process, but a closure of opportunities. You would think that with a democratized environment and the rise of a left-wing populist party, there would be more open spaces. But given the character of his austerity measures and his also quite authoritarian approach to national development, we actually see a closing down of opportunities in this coyuntura. So this tests Northern social movement theory assumptions about democratization and even leftist political change, right? Within this coyuntura, we see the proliferation of a discourse of national interests, leading by direct connection to El Pueblo. And in a sense, I feel that AMLO was kind of making a move that sought to incorporate what is a real applied political philosophy from the Zapatistas, mandar obedeciendo, to lead by obeying. But it's rather perverse, actually, because Mexico is not just one people. Yeah, so can you see that some of the contradictions begin to emerge? He really connected it to this idea of a new morality as well. And one that would necessitate further development in the country of the supposedly undeveloped areas, pointedly those places in the south of the country, to fund his rather considerable social programs. Now, I don't want to underestimate the import of the appeal of that. And if my partner were here right now, we'd be having this intense discussion. And I tend to think, step out of the role of pseudo-intellectual and look at why people vote for Morena. Because it has lifted people up from poverty, right? And it has overcome bureaucratic processes in the country. But at what cost when it comes to the executive having such overruling of the other branches of power within the national state? That is of concern, right, for any political scientist, or especially for activists that then have the force of the state used against them. The social programs have been important though, yeah? For example, direct transfers to impoverished communities. Now, no previous government would ever have done that. It's a little bit like Lula in Brazil in his first term. Significant overturning of the most extreme poverty in the country. However, 50% of Mexicans still work within the informal economy, and so it's not a class restructure, right? It's not post-neoliberal in that way. And you might also see it as being questionable on some grounds, because if you're doing direct transfers rather than doing it through the state infrastructure, you might be doing a preferential system to gain votes, right? You can look at it in different optics. What does this represent politically? Is it assistencialismo, handouts for favors? Mexican politics in its corporatist structure, has long involved forms of clientelism. I don't know if that term is familiar to you, but whereby popular political candidates exchange favors, to gain votes, and that's how people build political power.
What does direct transfer mean?
It means, effectively, imagine it this way. This is a simplified version. BSB, account number, you get money immediately.
Oh.
Yeah. And, this is significant for people who live in the most impoverished and marginalized contexts in Mexico. And that overrides all of the political process within the state, which would seek to block supply, right, for such programs. So AMLO has engineered something of significance. But what's funding it is neo-developmentalism and extractivism and more incursions into territories. So this is where we really hit a wall, to put it that way. But good question. Okay, so the discourses of those involved in socio-environmental struggles in what is often called the eco-territorial turn in Latin America are that their struggle is not just about being a radical leftist or anti-neoliberal. It's a struggle for life, for the means of social reproduction itself. The defence of territory, therefore, is about a defence of the spaces that already exist, where local economies operate. That's what territory means, the ability to survive and work with one's own political forms of organisation that pre-exist. So there's struggles against the imposition of models of development upon local forms of economy and governance. You can see a little poster there that says webinar, gas equals dispossession. Local struggles against mega projects in Mexico and Europe. So already having conversations globally, right? I'd need to put on my glasses to see the rest of it. But this was done during the pandemic, I believe. And people definitely, as they would say in Chile, during the moments of the rising of the student movement, students are the ones that give the class. Students dando cátedra. So people on the ground educate. That's very much like leading by obeying, isn't it? The Zapatista philosophy. So pooling resources, coming together as activists online, offline. This is using terms like defense of life, that in the US probably would be used as anti-abortion, right? But that's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about the continuity of life worlds and livelihood locally. A respect for, also the insistence of, a respect for horizontal, properly administered processes of consultation, informed consent, as exists within the instrument of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the International Labour Law 69. Yeah? So it's not extra legal by any means. Yeah? There's a basis for this. Proper environmental impact assessment process, not speed tracked by corporate interests. Yeah? And a demonstration of partnership and benefits to community. This is basically the grounds upon which people oppose and seek to detain, to stop these sorts of developmentalist initiatives, because they have their own economic practices. And if you watched any of the videos for today's tutorial, or there was just the one, in the isthmus, women making honey, having herbal medicine shops and industries, farming the fields, growing things locally. All of that exists. Why should it be run over by wind farms? Yeah, to cite that example again. So being a land defender, one is engaged in defensive resistance against what in Spanish is despojo. I'd like us to keep that term and pose some questions around it. Dispossession by accumulation, I mean, that's David Harvey's analysis of neoliberalism. You're probably aware of his work. But despojo also means stripping, removal, a physical pulling away. So it's very much based on materiality of life and earth. Yeah? It's not just dispossession in this kind of abstract English noun form. Despojo is deeper than dispossession. It still points to dispossession, but it also points to open-cut minds and exactly that, what we started off with, the reconquest, or the continuation of the conquest through the primarization of basic natural common goods. Yeah? So in this context, the meanings of land are much further than just this idea of a border, a state, a nation. Yeah? It's a way of life, it's one's workplace, one's emplacement, ways of doing and being and continuing relations. Yeah? For those who use the term territories, this refers to spaces of not just and probably also non-capitalist relations. Yeah? Memory, resistance. The Zapotec resisted the Aztec Empire as well. They have hundreds of years, millennia of continuity there. And here we see the importance of comunalidad. By announcing themselves this way, they are against a territorial reorganisation from above, which is inherent to this kind of model of special economic zones for mega projects. And against despojo, fundamentally. I'm not sure how much time we'll have. Keep sipping your chai. But effectively, we'll be centering on 3 mega projects in the UMNO period, with grounds for considerable struggle. Before we go further, though, this was a post from the media that was, social media, that was hashtag yo prefiero la vida, I prefer life. And, we know about framing in social movements, yeah? And we know that it can be very effective to come up with hashtags. Yo prefiero el río, I prefer the river. So many began to morph and permutate through the digital environment. It's something that you can easily latch onto. I prefer life, against the projects of death, which is what activists have been invoking as well. When land defenders say that UMNO's fourth transformation, and ironically his National Guard, he said that he was all about abrazos, no balas, hugs, not bullets, that he was going to end violence in the country. but then he immediately reorganized the military into his National Guard, yeah? All of this happened so quickly. When land defenders say AMLO's fourth transformation in his National Guard promote projects of death, and they, as defenders, are defending life, it is not a metaphor. This was the case with previous governments, whether or not it mattered that these projects were pushed by Morena or the main parties. So in Mexico, we've been fond of kind of just creating an acronym because it's the same, yeah? PRIAN, between PRI and PAN. Or by a range of private interests, in example, transnational companies. The projects of death discourse can then be understood as a reverse discourse. This is very Foucauldian, yeah? Because the developmentalist and neo-indigenist gaze sees a lot of promise in dispossession, labour slavery, including in newly installed industries and cleared territories. But for movements, these are policies of extermination alongside the violence that always accompanies them. How is that sowing life? And this is a translation from Spanish, so it's a bit clunky. But there was a program announced by AMLO called Sembrando Vida to encourage rural regeneration. But if that's accompanied by violence against communities, yeah, and mega projects, then how's that sowing life? That's what the poster is suggesting. The hope of Mexico, La Esperanza de México, also that's how Morena badged itself. La Esperanza de México, very good branding, definitely. A Mexico that doesn't recognize the peoples. Never again a Mexico without us, said the Zapatistas, nunca más un México sin nosotros. No? If you study this in detail, you'll understand that bargaining with life and death is not simply a rhetorical twist. These mega projects mean death in a literal sense, also biodiversity. By contrast, land gives life. So this is a different ontology, isn't it? If we want to build on the focus from last week, a different political ontology. It may not be the bio-necropolitics the way many theorists frame it, but it's certainly colonialism. So it's obviously a very incendiary kind of quite dense statement, but you can sort of see that it is a counter-rhetorical move, yeah, in the context of this new leftist hegemony. Yo prefiero la vida. All right, land has long been central to indigenous peoples in Mexico. It was central in the 1910-1920 Mexican Revolution with the slogan Tierra y Libertad, land and freedom, and la tierra es de quien la trabaja. Land is of those who work it. Yeah? And these weren't just mere slogans, they emerged from the revolutionary energies of people like Emiliano Zapata, yeah, and Pancho Villa. You might have heard of Pancho Villa, popular insurrectional leaders. The first revolution of the 20th century was not the Russian Revolution, it was the Mexican one, just to shift focus. So Emiliano Zapata was a hero but also martyr because he represented something too radical, yeah. Even for those who were sick of Porfirio Diaz and his reign, which is basically what prompted to overthrow this oligarch of the late 19th century, the Mexican Revolution. But it was from elements within the intellectual class, yeah, who then sought to align with popular energies, yeah, in territories. But even the concept of Mexico as a nation did not really truly get forged until the post-revolutionary period. Post-revolution reforms initially in the 20s and 30s were enacted under Lázaro Cárdenas. That was the beginning and the end of leftism in the country, in many ways, in the political formal processes. Yeah? He created a new communal land scheme and regime of property relations that defined territory in accordance of communal ownership. The ejido. So this is foundational post-revolution. So it's kind of ironic that AMLO summons up the revolution as if he's inheriting that and furthering it through the fourth transformation. But anyway, Zapata, decades hence, Emiliano Zapata, land and freedom, the land is of he or she who works it, inspires the emergence, obviously, of Neo-Zapatismo, the Zapatistas in Chiapas, and they're also known as the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the Zapatista National Liberation Army, yeah? Because of the unfulfilled promises of the revolution, because between 1910 and 1920, which was possibly one of the most violent periods, it didn't just make martyrs of important people like Zapata and Pancho Villa, but also was a major thing to recover from, and involved kind of civil war as well, especially against Christians. I shouldn't laugh because there was a guerra dentro de la revolución. There was a war within the revolution that was called the Christ War, And so obviously the radical parts of the left that said, no, we want a secular state and we're Marxists and that kind of thing. And they also waged war amongst themselves. And so it was a really destabilising period. But then what happened subsequently with Lázaro Cárdenas was supposed to fulfil some of the central goals of that revolution: land redistribution on communal terms for peasants, many of whom were indigenous. The threat to land and communal systems, however, was first most visible with the signing of NAFTA. Have we all heard of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement? That's been renegotiated between Canada, the United States and Mexico, and they now have a different instrument in place, but it's similar in design. Obviously Trump wants more influence there, but the US always had it, actually, within NAFTA. So what happened? What was of most import and resulted in, for example, the emergence of the Zapatistas from the Lacandona jungle to declare death to the Mexican state, right? It was Article 27 that was modified. This was in the Constitution, the protection of communal lands, So Article 27 was a reform that was enacted en route to NAFTA to erode and effectively dispense with the ejido communal land system. This happened in the context of PRI, the reigning party of perfect dictatorship of 70 plus years. Once Article 27 of the Constitution was modified between 1920, I'm really going back in time, back to the revolution, 1992 and 1993. This is just before NAFTA goes into effect, so it's not a coincidence. As a necessary precondition for the entry of the force of NAFTA, 3 other laws aimed at promoting investment of private capital throughout the national territory, the mining law, the national waters law, and foreign investment law, were enacted. With the first, mining activity is recognised as a preferred and of public utility instrument. Interesting. Thereby validating that those companies who had the authorization through a concession from the federal executive take advantage of minerals in the subsoil would automatically have the right to request the expropriation of land on which the activity was to be carried out. With the second, this gives way to the privatization of water services, citing the Article 20 of the Constitution, the possibility that the nation assign the right to exploit, use, and this is just a translationese thing, extract water and give it over to third parties through the legal status of a concession. So this is a pivotal change, right? Not just land, but also water. Finally, the third, the previous limits or restrictions on the investment of foreign capital in Mexico equates foreign investment with Mexican investment, basically eroding any borders, This permitted the entry of mining and other mega projects to accelerate. All of this occurs within the context of the war on drugs. Now, from 2006 onwards, something like 600,000 people have died and or disappeared in the country, which is more than under any dictatorship in the rest of the region. Displacement from territory as well, including of indigenous people, mass migrations. Contention over territory from cartels, often in rural areas, including Guerrero and Michoacán, also Jalisco and the states of the north and the Gulf of Mexico. Well, this occurs because land is cleared for poppy harvesting, which obviously, is the basis for heroin, and distribution. Such territory is strategic for drug production and exportation to the US. Vested interests, or what we might call de facto powers, particularly within that period where the pre-losers and then the National Action Party, which was a right-wing party, comes to power, the question of, with the emergence of de facto powers and what people call the narco state, right, becomes important here for territory, for local communities. Because basically the cartels, backed also by the federal army, given that there's vested interests and parallel interests between the state and the cartels, really impacts in terms of territorial control, the drug economy, and the parallel rise of neoliberalism and extractivism in the country and organised crime syndicates. It's a very complex picture. You have to imagine that communities are caught in the crosshairs of all this, especially between 2000 and 2012, which is the high point of the war on drugs. The imbrication of state, and one would also say the war on terror. They're kind of paired, if you think about it. The imbrication of state, private and organised crime, narco interests in territory is really where this takes off with the war on drugs, resulting in a form of armed neoliberalism, which is used in the literature. So far from the free market ideals, something very militarised, in fact. This changes as a map, and you would have seen that Claudia Sheinbaum's government actually took out a kingpin. Do you remember a couple of months ago when that happened? I mean, their intelligence operations, in conjunction with the United States, I believe, resulted in that. Pressures from the US. But the US is the primary recipient of the drug economy, and I don't know, see the series 000 if you want a fictional account of that. But here we have a map that shows the main drug cartels, but also changes post-2012. So different forms of hegemony that kind of sit alongside the political sphere, but are not entirely outside of it. And you can see 2024, how much territory these different cartels, from the Sinaloa to the Juarez, to the Jalisco cartel, the Gulf cartel, the Northeast cartel, the Familia cartel, and also other contested territories. We cannot separate this from environmental and territorial struggles in the country, especially when activists are assassinated, unfortunately. I briefly mentioned the rise of the new PRI, which was that 6-year period with Peña Nieto, with the soap opera wife, who divorced him after he lost power. Anyway, that sounds like gossip, but this is part of the ADA. The return of PRI under Enrique Peña Nieto was marked by accelerating violence and the ramping up of displacement and disappearances. State complicity in the same has been shown, particularly with the 43 disappeared students from Guerrero, from the Ayotzinapa normal school. They were in a teachers training college. 43 young men, indigenous, were disappeared and calcified, burned. Their bus was hijacked and they just were disappeared. No accountability, but there's proof that the federal forces were also involved along with local drug lords. Very difficult. People are still demanding a process of justice and redress over this, by the way. Indigenous. But also that teachers' college was traditionally the training ground for popular education and Marxist theory. Mass movements for justice emerged, particularly in the Enrique Peña Nieto 6 years. The politicization of the military is marked. Necropolitics, the politics of death, literally, and the state under PRI becomes really delegitimized. When EPN, or Peña Nieto, first came to power, He was promising an economic miracle, and he made the cover of Time magazine. I'm not sure if these slides have that, but it quickly turned. Yeah. In these 6 years, people really felt absolutely fed up. That's what hartazgo refers to, where you're just, how much more gives kind of thing. The PRI and the main parties were dubbed by AMLO as the mafia del poder, the mafia of power. So Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, first of all, he's well branded. Yeah? He had, for successive elections, nearly won. Yeah, nearly won. And Morena started off as a movement. But it had to get to this point of hartazgo, total exhaustion and fed upness, yeah, for people to, vote massively, turn out in huge numbers for AMLO. And in the first case of actual, transparent elections from foreign observers, it was largely free of fraud. Yeah. Presidential forms, however, that had been enacted by EPN and were very unpopular, like the energy reform, allowing for further private investment and ownership of infrastructure projects by foreign companies in the country, also accelerated a lot of conflict. The teachers' movement was really important at this time as well. There's so many cases we could talk about. But it's really here that Morena goes from being, that sort of outlier, grassroots thing to a mainstreaming political force, and then wins the election. Yeah. 2018, massive electoral change. Everything goes red. This is unprecedented. Yeah. So Manuel López Obrador, he won 51.5616%. The opposition candidates had no chance. Only in 2 states did Anaya, who was the PAN National Action Party right-wing candidate, get any kind of sway. So at all levels of government, Morena just absolutely swept the political landscape. AMLO promised to review and rescind private mining and other energy industry concessions. His appeal to national values, honesty, social programs, pledges to the poor, and opposition to neoliberalism was obviously really important in that discourse. He'd been in opposition for many years, and Morena had moved from being a movement to then amassing as a coalition force and a political party. His history is interesting because he headed up in the 70s in Tabasco, which is the state that he's from, the oil-producing state of Tabasco. You'd be familiar with the Tabasco sauce, right? But it's not just an exporter of Chile, also petrol. So he was a state bureaucrat from very early days. He was in the Indigenous Institute in Tabasco, but he's not Indigenous. Yeah. He made gestures towards state inclusion of Indigenous people, but still sees them as needing development. Yeah? Simultaneously then can be seen as both neo-developmentalist and indigenist, that is appropriating of certain indigenous energies and symbols. Yeah? The Zapatistas, in fact, had long warned people about AMLO as not representing anything outside of the mafia del poder, the mafia of power that he kept insisting was all the other parties, but instead part of it. So in his 6 years, we see a political repositioning. There are changes in the elite, obviously, but it's a new hegemony, a new leftist populist hegemony, invoking anti-corruption, but diminishing the civil sphere and returning to patrimonialism and presidentialism. The logic of sacrifice for national good is prominent, but is this really anti-neoliberal? Los pueblos y los territorios, what happens with the peoples, not just people, and their territories? Are they casualties in this sacrifice, this necessary sacrifice for the nation and the people? He has, and so has Claudia Sheinbaum, continued to pursue mega projects that work on the same logics and laws of previous arrangements of preceding parties and their agreements. And this has been going on for years, for even pre-revolution, yeah? So we're talking 100 plus years. Here are just some examples. We'll have to finish up really soon. He kind of badged these developmentalist initiatives as being poles of development, he called them. And all of that's in Spanish, but it encompasses everything from Yucatan, Mayan territory, and, the disruption of traditional agricultural practices to industrialization of agriculture, the use of GMO, corn. Corn is so important to Mexico. It's an ancestral grain. That's where it comes from. And that was massively opposed. The activists involved in different frentes there in the Yucatan Peninsula, Mayan region, they managed to throw Monsanto out of the country. So that's good news. But you can have political successes like that, and then you have a new president who pushes much of the same, right? The Mayan train, it went ahead in spite of a lot of opposition. Again, the use of indigenous symbolism. Why call it a Mayan train when communities are opposing it? So in the Mayan region, we see this crossing between Oaxaca to Veracruz of a new infrastructure project that supposedly was to modernize the region, but would actually permit further industrial activities, incursion into lands, as well as curtains of development, to use his phrase, poles of development, to detain southern migration from Central America, and to try to create new industrial activities like maquiladora labor. Has anyone heard that term maquiladora before? The mass assembly plants, Sanyo, Sony, and people are forced into kind of contracts that are really bad for them, especially women, racialized women as well, but supposedly to guarantee that this would be a secure economic zone, Is this post-neoliberal? I just pose the question. These development poles offered the promise of infrastructure and energy, to power Mexico's economy and to do more social spending, which is so typical of leftist populism. We saw it in Ecuador, we saw it in Bolivia in the early 2000s. But such actions precede AMLO, and yet it's really in the new leftist hegemony that we just see the rise of further antagonisms, not spaces, right? So if you're being called a right-winger and dismissed out of turn, and then even assassinated after the president has visited, like a couple of days later, as in the case of Samir Flores, who was a Nahuatl-speaking indigenous man and activist from Amalcinco, Amilcinco. He comes from the same part of Mexico as Zapata himself, So, 3 loci, Mayan territory, Yucatan, Campeche, already had seen struggles against GMO soy, monocrops and Monsanto. The clearing of land for the same, as well as wind farms, pig farms. Do you remember the swine flu? That arose because of the sorts of industrialized agriculture that had been imposed there. Oaxaca, we see this week, wind farms, so-called new renewables, also mining. Especially though with the Trans-Isthmus corridor, which the Mayan train was sort of packed into as well, as a way of creating a new crossing that would rival like the Panama Canal, for example, for global trade and exportation. Morelos, where both Zapata came from, the revolutionary, and also Samir Flores, that unfortunately was assassinated. There is a very important front that's called the FPDTA, and they're consistently opposing the so-called Morelos Comprehensive Project, the construction of a gas pipeline across 3 states and 2 thermoelectric power plants on very delicate territory that's basically ringed by volcanoes. It makes absolutely no sense, because if you've got thermoelectric power plants and gas pipelines running through there, they're unstable. But so much foreign investment has gone into these energy projects without the consent of communities. And so this front, which is of the peoples, yeah, Morelos, Puebla, and Tlaxcala, is an important ground for resistance right now. All right, let's leave it there because we have kind of finished and we went a little bit over time. But I know that we also arrived, gently. Hope you enjoyed the chai and the ada. I'll see you in the tutorial. Oh, by the way, you're welcome to come to the tutorial if you wish.
I do have to prepare for exams.
There's so much going on. Thank you so much. And if you